Some journeys don't begin with an open door, but with a heart once closed off by a harsh life, now gently cradled open. Flight 497 to Los Angeles departed that day like any other flight. The first-class cabin carried the subtle scent of premium fabric and the sweet trace of licorice from hot towels. Overhead lights glowed a warm amber, and each crisp click of seat belts fastening echoed in a rhythmic pattern, composing a quiet symphony of elegance and serenity. Amid that calm atmosphere in Seat 1A, the most prestigious spot on the plane, sat an elderly black woman. Her silver hair was neatly pinned at the nape of her neck. Her skin, folded by time, carried the grace of age, but her eyes were unusually bright, deep as though they had witnessed far more than most people dared to remember. Her name was Sarah Washington, 72 years old. No one in the cabin knew that this quiet woman was the mother of one of America's youngest and most powerful CEOs, Julian Washington, the billionaire founder of Washington Global. But Sarah never cared about titles. To her, that man was still the little boy in a torn coat running through the snow, clutching his first paper marked with an A, shouting, "Mama, I did it." And what had she done to raise that boy into a man? Everything. She had worked the night shift mopping hospital floors. She had washed dishes in crowded restaurants where the manager's yelling was a daily ritual. She sold vegetables at the market each morning, then dozed off on the bus in the afternoon. All of it to pay tuition, afford a warm meal, and buy her son one more chance. Today, Sarah flew first class for the first time in her life. Seat 1A wasn't just a seat. It symbolized an entire journey of rising above prejudice, poverty, and injustice that she had silently endured. The plane hadn't taken off yet. She reached for her glass of sparkling water from the tray, took a sip, then leaned back into the seat and smiled softly. Not because of the comfort surrounding her, but because in her heart there was a rare feeling of peace. Her son had made it, and he hadn't forgotten where he came from. No one else in the cabin knew, and none could have predicted that this peaceful flight would turn into a storm, and the quiet woman sitting there would be the first to bear its brunt. And then, from the airplane door, the sound of high heels echoed each step, a sharp click that announced the arrival of someone else. It was a different world. A slow-burning confrontation was approaching. The steady beat of heels struck the cabin floor. A few passengers turned to glance curiosity flitting across their eyes before they quietly returned to their magazines or phones. But Sarah didn't move her gaze from the window unaware, or perhaps unfazed by the footsteps that would soon carry a chill across first class. The woman who entered was Victoria Langford White, about 40, slender in a designer cream dress, a golden watch glinting on her wrist, and Versace sunglasses still resting on her face despite the soft cabin lighting. Victoria needed no introduction. She was a familiar name for the flight attendants on this route, a diamond-tier customer who always requested Seat 1A and frequently complained if anything was not up to standard. Victoria's eyes swept through the cabin rows as though inspecting a private showcase curated just for her. Then she stopped. Seat 1A. Occupied. Not by just anyone, but by an elderly black woman, silver-haired and unassuming against the backdrop of plush leather. Victoria paused, saying nothing for a few seconds. Perhaps she was trying to decide whether this was a technical error or something unacceptable happening in real time. A few nearby passengers sensed a subtle tension, and the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. Victoria slowly removed her sunglasses, her eyes sharp and cold, fixed on Sarah. No greetings, no softening. Her voice rang out clearly polite in tone, but icy in delivery. "Excuse me, but it looks like you're in the wrong seat. 1A is mine." Sarah turned her expression calm, not startled. Her gaze met Victoria's unflinching, unlowered, unbothered. "Just present. I understand. But my ticket clearly says Seat 1A. I don't believe there's been any mistake. Victoria offered a tight, polite smile, a smile laced with condescension. She turned toward the aisle where a flight attendant stood watching. Kyle, she called, her voice a bit louder enough to still the entire first-class cabin. Something's wrong. I always sit here. I'm a regular passenger. Why hasn't my seat been assigned correctly? Kyle. The young attendant hurried over. His face tightened the moment he recognized Victoria. It wasn't the first time he'd served her, and he knew her demands well. We do apologize, Ms. Langford, Kyle said in a quieter voice as he approached. But according to the system seat, 1A today was reserved by Sarah Washington. Sarah finished gently, as if saving him from embarrassment. Victoria turned back to Sarah, her blue eyes sharp as blades. She didn't speak immediately, but her stare carried one unmistakable message: rejection. I don't know what kind of mix-up this is, she said, her tone floating mid-air, but I'm a Diamond member. I take this route 3 times a month. I always sit here. It's my standard. Sarah said nothing more. She adjusted her scarf, kept her eyes forward, and rested her hand gently on the armrest. Kyle glanced between the two women. He hesitated for a beat, and that's when Bias spoke. Mrs. Washington. He began, his voice low. We can offer you an equivalent seat still in first class, but if you're willing to move, we'll upgrade your meal and provide a voucher for your next flight. The cabin grew heavy. A few passengers shook their heads. Some pressed their lips together. Others looked away. But everyone knew what was happening. No one said it aloud, yet all could see who was being pressured to move, not because of reason, but because of rank color and demeanor. Sarah remained still, her face unchanged, but her eyes sharpened. I'm sorry, she said, soft but steady. I don't mean to cause trouble, but I am not in the wrong seat. And I don't believe I should have to move just because someone is used to being prioritized. That sentence landed like a stone in a still lake. Kyle had no response. Victoria inhaled, her eyes narrowing. The conflict was far from over. Sarah, the mother who had endured a lifetime of being overlooked, was no longer willing to step aside. The air in the first-class cabin had turned thick. No one spoke yet. Every eye was subtly watching. Some passengers lowered their heads to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. Others exchanged quiet, uneasy glances. No one wanted to get involved, but everyone could feel something deeply wrong unfolding right in front of them. Victoria Langford took another step forward, squarely beside Mrs. Sarah Washington, her arms crossed in front of her chest posture, tall and rigid, a silent declaration. I don't want to escalate this, she said, her voice smooth, but each word slicing through the air like a razor. But it seems we've lost all respect for basic rules here. Sarah raised her head slowly. Her eyes remained calm, as still and deep as an autumn lake. There was no fear in them, no anger, no fear, no anger, only firmness and sorrow. Basic rules, she asked softly. Would you mind explaining what you mean? Victoria curled her lip into a half-smile. I'm simply saying, in first class, there are certain expectations. Perhaps things would be more comfortable if everyone sat in the seat that's appropriate for them. A sentence that on its surface sounded harmless, but every syllable sank in like acid. Sarah understood all too clearly what was being implied. What was that seat? What was the so-called seat that's appropriate for her? Where exactly did she belong? In Victoria's eyes, she didn't fit in seat 1A, simply because she was an elderly black woman in modest clothing, wearing no luxury watch, no designer heels. She had known that look, those layered sorting stares, since she was young. She had been denied housing, employment, and even checkout priority at grocery stores, not because she lacked money, but because she didn't fit the image of a customer. But today, she would not be silent. I understand the rules of first class quite clearly, Sarah said, her voice low and steady. And I understand what you mean by appropriate. But I paid for this seat like any other passenger. I booked it just like anyone else. If something needs to change, it's not my seat. It's the way some people choose to see others. A few passengers nodded subtly in quiet agreement. A middle-aged man in seat 2C exhaled slowly, his gaze resting on Sarah with silent respect. But Victoria wasn't about to let the balance tip. "Kyle," she said sharply, unable to mask her irritation, "I want you to call the flight supervisor. I can't start a long flight with this kind of disruption, and I will not accept being denied the seat I've always been assigned." The pressure on Kyle grew heavy. He stammered something inaudible, bowed his head, and made the call. Sarah sighed gently. She wasn't surprised, but saddened not by Victoria's words, but by the young man's inability to stand up for what was right out of fear of trouble. Minutes later, the flight supervisor, Olivia Marsh, arrived. She was a tall, white woman in a crisp uniform, with a stern face and practiced poise. Her eyes scanned from Victoria to Sarah to Kyle. One look was enough to read the entire situation. "Good afternoon," Olivia began with her rehearsed professional tone. "We were informed of a seat confusion. We'd like to resolve this promptly to ensure the flight remains on schedule." Victoria jumped in before anyone else could speak. "I specifically requested seat 1A, as I always do. I'm a Diamond Tier client, but now someone else is sitting there. I believe this is just a mistake." "And I believe it is not," Sarah interjected gently but firmly. "My ticket clearly shows seat 1A. I don't think I have any less right to do so today because I don't sit here often." Olivia hesitated. Her eyes flicked to Kyle for confirmation. Kyle gave a brief nod, then lowered his gaze. "We can arrange another seat of the same class for you, Mrs. Washington," Olivia offered, still trying to maintain composure. "We'll keep your status and offer a few additional amenities." Sarah turned away, not responding immediately. She looked out the window as if quietly asking herself how many times she'd been asked to move to avoid conflict and survive unnoticed. Then she turned back. Her eyes locked onto Olivia's, and this time there was no softness left. "I'm sorry, but I'm no longer at an age where I must stay silent to make others comfortable." Olivia froze. Sarah's tone was calm, with no anger or threat. But the quiet steel in her words made one thing very clear: she would not yield. The cabin fell into a kind of frozen hush. Every other sound disappeared except the whisper of wind outside the plane window. Something in Sarah's gaze made even an experienced supervisor like Olivia pause. Whatever pre-scripted apology she had prepared no longer felt appropriate. Victoria, on the other hand, had no such restraint. She stomped a heel on the floor, clacking a sharp sound that cut through the heavy quiet like a blade. "This is absurd," she burst out. "A Diamond Tier passenger treated like this? I've never been humiliated this way." Sarah didn't look at her. Instead, she calmly reached into her small handbag, pulling out a sleek, modern smartphone that seemed too new for someone her age. It was a birthday gift from Julian last year. The screen lit up as she unlocked it with her fingerprint. She scrolled past a list of familiar names and stopped on one Julian, my son. One gentle tap, the phone to her ear. In a tall glass building in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, Julian Washington, CEO of Washington Global, stood before a strategy board presenting a new investment rollout to his regional directors. A sharp mind in a dark gray suit, he was not only admired for his leadership, but respected for his firm moral compass. The phone on his table buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and when he saw Mom, he immediately paused. "Excuse me, everyone. I need to take this," he said quickly, stepping out of the meeting, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" His voice softened at once. Sarah's voice came through the line steady but tinged with a sorrow that only a son would hear. I'm all right. But I'm being asked to leave the seat I booked just because someone else thinks I don't belong in it. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. The hallway, thick with carpet and glass, felt suddenly too silent. A cold rage stirred inside him, not hot and reckless, but deep, icy, and precise. The kind that only rises when someone touches the dignity of the one you love most. You're still in your seat, right? He asked. Of course. But I thought you should know. Julian clenched his hand, his lips pressed into a thin line. He needed no further details. His mother never overreacted. It would not have been a misunderstanding if she had called him now. Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of it. Stay calm. Stay seated. I trust you, Julian, she said quietly. Not because you have power, but because you know how to use it. Julian hung up. Without missing a beat, he pulled out his business phone, searched his contacts, and called another number, Thomas Grayson, CEO of Asteria Airlines. Julian, you're calling just as I was about to message you about our new partnership. Thomas answered cheerfully. Thomas Julian cut in voice, cool and level. My mother is currently aboard one of your flights. She's being asked to leave her first-class seat, the one she booked, because another passenger believes she doesn't belong there. Worse, the crew is siding with that passenger. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Julian, I truly apologize. I wasn't aware. I'll investigate immediately. I don't need an apology. Thomas, Julian said, cold and clear. I need action. Right now. If your airline intends to maintain a relationship with Washington, global justice must come first. This isn't just about my mother. It's about every passenger who's ever been looked down on because of how they appear. Thomas needed no further warning. He knew Julian's words were never empty. I'll send someone to the cabin immediately, and I promise whoever mishandled this will be removed. Thank you for calling, Julian, and please extend my sincerest apologies to your mother. Julian said nothing. He ended the call, then turned back toward his boardroom. But this time, the charts and strategies no longer filled his mind. Now he could only think of one truth. No single soul had the right to diminish the woman who taught him justice through sweat and sacrifice. Back in seat 1A, Sarah slipped her phone back into her bag. Her hand remained gently resting on the armrest. Her face didn't betray much, but anyone watching closely would have seen it. A flicker of light had just awakened in her eyes. Something had shifted, quietly, but irreversibly. The soft rumble of wheels rolled across the cabin carpet, then stopped just outside the first-class section. Moments later, firm footsteps echoed distinct from the haughty clicks of Victoria Langford's heels earlier. 2 men in black suits wearing high-level staff badges from Asteria Airlines entered the cabin as though they carried an entirely different air, cold, precise, and uncompromising. The man leading them, gray-streaked hair, stern face, and piercing eyes, spoke with a deep voice that wasn't loud but rang out like the toll of a brass bell. I'm Richard Thompson, Regional Executive Vice President of Asteria Airlines. Per directive from the Executive Chairman, I need to speak immediately with the staff responsible for this cabin. The entire cabin fell silent. Olivia, the flight supervisor, stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward hesitantly. Kyle, the young flight attendant, stood beside her, his face pale. Victoria turned her head sharply, startled and visibly uneasy. Richard's gaze swept over them like a scalpel. I'll ask only once. Can anyone explain why a passenger, specifically Mrs. Sarah Washington, who lawfully booked seat 1A, was asked to vacate it, simply because another passenger is accustomed to sitting there? No one answered. The atmosphere turned brittle like glass ready to crack. Kyle opened his mouth, but no words came out. Olivia struggled to find her voice. We're only trying to avoid a confrontation between passengers. Ms. Langford is a diamond-tier customer who regularly requests that seat. So you decided to pressure a 72-year-old black woman to surrender her seat. Richard cut in, his voice steady, but cold with precision. Under which policy exactly? Olivia swallowed. Kyle dropped his gaze, saying nothing. Richard exhaled, then turned to face the cabin, finally stopping in front of Sarah. For the first time, his tone softened. Mrs. Washington. On behalf of Asteria Airlines, I sincerely apologize for what occurred. We failed you not just in service, but in moral conduct. Sarah gave a slight nod, saying nothing. She didn't need more apologies. She had heard enough of those in her lifetime. What she waited for was action. Richard turned back to Olivia and Kyle. Effective immediately per executive order, you are suspended from duty. A formal investigation will be launched to review the entire service protocol. A faint murmur rippled through the cabin. Not shock, but disbelief that justice was unfolding in real time. Olivia stood paralyzed, her face drained of color. Kyle looked like he might cry, his eyes searching Sarah's face for forgiveness. But she didn't look at him. Not out of cruelty, simply because it was too late for apologies when damage had become normalized. Victoria abruptly stood up. Wait, this is insane. I did nothing wrong. I was just asking for what I've always been given. Richard turned to her, his eyes like ice. Ms. Langford, your behavior did not just disrupt this flight. It displayed clear discrimination and disregard for a fellow passenger. You are also being asked to leave the aircraft. You've got to be kidding. Victoria snapped, her voice shrill. I'm one of your highest-tier clients. I could sue you. You may, Richard replied coolly, and we are fully prepared to prove in court that morality cannot be bought with loyalty points. Two uniformed security agents approached Victoria quietly. She stood frozen, not composed, not proud, just the exposed core of someone being forced to face accountability for the first time. She turned to Sarah, eyes wild. You made me lose everything. Sarah simply shook her head gently. No one can take away what you truly possess. If you lost everything just because I remained in my seat, maybe you never had anything real. The floor thudded under Victoria's heels as she stormed out, no longer elegant or robust. Her steps sounded hollow and sharp, stripped of all meaning. Silence lingered inside the cabin. Then, from the back, a hesitant round of applause began, slowly unsure, then grew, gathering strength, until the cabin was filled with united clapping. Some passengers nodded toward Sarah. A middle-aged man placed a hand over his heart and bowed respectfully. Richard lowered his head as well. Mrs. Washington, we owe you far more than an apology. But from this moment forward, it will not happen again, not to you nor to anyone else made to feel small. Sarah smiled for the first time on the flight. I don't need special treatment. I just want to be treated like a human being. At that moment, Seat 1A ceased to represent privilege. It became a symbol of dignity, and the equality that a civilized society must defend. Victoria Langford took her final steps out of the first-class cabin, her face hard as stone. But when her eyes passed over the seat where Sarah still sat, steady present, something broke inside her. A silent implosion. The collapse of her long-held sense of superiority erupted into a rage she couldn't contain. She stopped, turned around. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice stripped of all pretense. You think you've won? An old black woman sitting here just because of her son's power? Pathetic. Gasps echoed throughout the cabin. Sarah didn't respond. She remained seated solid as stone. No retaliation, no retreat. Victoria stepped closer, pointing directly at her. I've flown this airline for 15 years. I helped build its reputation. I'm diamond tier. I'm the one people move aside for. The security agents stepped forward, blocking her path. One of them said calmly, Ms. Langford, you are ordered to leave the aircraft. If you continue resisting, we will proceed with enforcement. Enforcement? Who do you think you are? She shrieked, her voice trembling with rage. Another flight attendant approached Sarah, resting a hand on her seat, an unspoken gesture of support. But Sarah's gaze remained fixed on Victoria, not with vengeance, but with the clarity of someone who had seen every version of her before, and no longer needed to be surprised. Victoria wasn't done. She flung her arm wildly, pointing at the passengers. All of you will regret siding with her. I'll sue this airline. I'll get all of you fired. I'll use every connection, every cent I have to tear you down. Do you hear me, older woman? You'll pay for embarrassing me. Her screams pierced the silence, making a baby cry in the back. A young mother hugged her child tightly. The tension exploded like a shockwave. Sarah didn't move, but this time she spoke. Her voice was as soft as breath, but it traveled through the entire cabin. No one embarrassed you. You just tore off your mask. The words hit like a blow. Not loud, not cruel, just genuine, undeniably true. Victoria gasped. Her eyes widened, and she staggered back as security closed in. She began to resist, still shouting curses and threats. I won't let this go. You'll all pay. One flight attendant calmly radioed, requesting the ground crew. The passenger is non-compliant. Escalating. Prepare for removal upon jet bridge arrival. Within moments, the cabin door opened again. 2 airport security officers stepped in their faces, stern with resolve. One of them spoke, Ms. Langford, you are now required to deplane under aviation safety regulations. Continued refusal will result in physical removal under protocol. Victoria struggled, but this time no one listened to her. No one feared her. No one saw her as the center of anything anymore. She was escorted off the aircraft, not with her head held high, but in the broken defiance of someone who had long lived on a pedestal and couldn't bear the fall. Silence returned as the cabin door shut behind her, but not the tense silence from before. This time it was the hush of peace restored. Sarah remained seated, her hand gently resting on the side of the teacup that a young attendant had just placed before her. She did not need to say another word. Everything that needed to be said had already been said for her. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned toward his wife and whispered just loud enough to be heard, I think we just witnessed something much bigger than an argument. His wife nodded. We just saw justice in its oldest, most beautiful form. Sarah closed her eyes and rested her head back. There was no joy in retribution, only a quiet relief, like an old suitcase finally set down after far too long a journey. She knew this wasn't the end, but from this moment forward, she would no longer carry the weight alone. The truth had spoken, and the world had listened. The first-class cabin settled into an eerie calm after the aircraft door closed behind Victoria Langford. The atmosphere felt liberated from an invisible weight, like a lake surface finally freed from the grip of an underwater storm. No one spoke loudly, but their eyes had changed. They no longer saw Mrs. Sarah as a black elderly woman in the wrong seat. They saw her as someone who had done what most of them never dared, stood her ground. Not with power, but dignity. A young flight attendant, her eyes slightly misty, gently refilled Sarah's cup of tea and whispered, I'm so sorry for what happened, but thank you, truly thank you. Mrs. Sarah smiled and nodded as if to say the girl had no reason to apologize for others. Kindness, even when late, always carries meaning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Julian Washington didn't stop at a phone call to the airline. He knew this couldn't be swept under the rug with a PR statement. His mother always said justice isn't something you negotiate behind closed doors. The next morning, Julian appeared before a national television broadcast, standing beside Thomas Grayson, the CEO of Asteria Airlines. Two powerful men, their faces carrying the solemn weight of confronting an uncomfortable truth. Thomas spoke first, slowly but firmly. "We take full responsibility for what happened on Flight 497, and we understand that an apology isn't enough. This wasn't the failure of one individual, but the failure of a system that's grown too comfortable with compromise and bias." Then Julian stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but each word struck like forged steel. "My mother, a 72-year-old woman, was asked to give up a first-class seat she had lawfully paid for. Not for safety, not due to a system error, but someone else believed she wasn't fit for that seat. Because she is who she is." The press room held its breath. "I'm not saying this to ask for special treatment for my mother. I'm saying it for everyone who has ever been looked at with contempt and was asked to step aside simply because they didn't look the part. This incident will not disappear as a technical glitch. Flashbulbs lit up like wildfire. Television networks, blogs, and social media were flooded with coverage of the speech. The hashtag #respect in the skies topped Twitter, TikTok, and community forums. People weren't just retelling an airline scandal, but sharing a symbol of courage and change. Celebrities, activists, and human rights organizations rallied behind Sarah Washington, calling her a woman who rekindled the flame of dignity in a noisy, distracted era. Shortly after, Asteria Airlines launched the most comprehensive reform campaign in its history, retraining all staff under the principle, "Respect is the default," adding cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias modules to mandatory training, establishing a passenger feedback council, including seniors, people of color, and individuals with disabilities. Most importantly, a strict ban on favoritism based on personal connections with staff or executives. In a closed-door meeting between Julian and the airline's board, one director quietly asked, "How much change do you think this will bring?" Julian didn't hesitate. "We can't change the world overnight. But if each of us stands when it counts, no one will have to suffer in silence again." As for Victoria Langford, within 3 days, her name disappeared from Asteria's elite lists. The fashion brands she once represented issued statements cutting ties. Videos of her onboard tirade flooded the internet, permanently unerasable. The voice that once symbolized elite entitlement now stood as a cautionary tale of unchecked privilege. She vanished from the media. No one heard from Victoria again. But Mrs. Sarah. She returned to her ordinary life. Only now, when she boarded any flight, the flight attendant's gazes lingered not to question but to greet her as an honored guest of quiet courage. At JFK Airport, sunset streamed through the glass terminal, casting a golden glow on polished floors and hurried footsteps. Julian Washington, no longer a high-profile CEO or public speaker, stood amid the crowd, just a son waiting for the woman who taught him the meaning of honor. A soft announcement came over the intercom. "Flight 497 from Los Angeles has landed. Passengers are arriving at Gate 6. Julian looked up, his eyes softened with anticipation. Once burdened with billion-dollar strategies, his shoulders bore only one thing: the longing to embrace his mother. And then she appeared. Mrs. Sarah stepped through the sliding doors with slow grace. A beige coat draped over her arm, silver hair neatly tucked back, and her eyes, still as clear and fierce as ever, spoke of a woman who had weathered every storm without losing herself. Julian rushed forward without ceremony, without pretense. He wrapped his arms around her in a deep, warm, silent embrace. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked softly, never letting go. I am now, she replied gently, patting his back. I am now. He stepped back and looked at her as if trying to memorize her face, the face of the woman who had given everything to teach him right from wrong and never once asked for anything in return. I'm sorry you had to face it alone, Julian murmured. I should have been there sooner. Mrs. Sarah shook her head, smiling. No, son. You showed up exactly when you needed to. Not because you came early, but because you did the right thing. You didn't use power to silence others. You used it to stand for what's right. I'm proud of you. Julian lowered his head, emotion swelling in his chest. Though the world saw him as one of the most fearless leaders of his generation under his mother's gaze, he just wanted to be small again, a child she once sewed jackets for with cracked fingers in the winter cold. I thought of you the whole flight, Julian said, taking her bag. Of all the times you were turned away because of your skin, pushed aside quietly because you were seen as less. And I wondered, if you had stayed silent back then, would I still have the courage to stand tall today? Mrs. Sarah held his gaze. Then she said, her voice raspy but clear, I stayed silent then because no one stood for me. But today I'm silent no longer, because you stood there. Julian froze. The words struck deep. Mother and son strolled out of the arrivals hall. Passers-by might have seen them as just two ordinary travelers unaware they were witnessing the center of a national conversation. But Sarah didn't care about fame. She only felt relief not from defeating anyone, but from not letting silence win. As they passed a group of onlookers, Julian leaned down and whispered, Looks like you're famous now, Mama. You ready for this? Sarah chuckled. I'm 72, Julian. I've lived long enough to know. Fame is like a spotlight. Pretty, but never as warm as a child's eyes listening to his mother. Julian paused, looking at her again, like a student absorbing the final lesson from the most outstanding teacher he'd ever known. Across the airport, a large screen replayed the morning's news. Her image in a humble old coat appeared alongside a now viral quote, I don't need privilege. I just want to be respected as a human being. Not shouted, not said on a grand stage, but it rang like a bell awakening a system grown too fond of the phrase, preferred passengers. That day, Sarah and Julian walked hand in hand through the terminal. No medals, no headlines in their pockets. But with each step they paved a quieter, lighter path for the millions who had carried the burden of silence for too long. And behind them, the sunset wasn't an ending. It was the light of a new beginning. Less than a week after the incident on Flight 497, Asteria Airlines headquarters were in crisis. It wasn't just a PR disaster, but a seismic shock to public trust, spreading at a pace no executive could contain. Clips of Victoria Langford losing her temper had been shared millions of times. But what truly captured people's attention was the calm, composed face of Mrs. Sarah Washington, along with the quote now printed and reposted everywhere, I don't need priority. I just want to be respected as a human being. It wasn't a revolutionary demand. It didn't call for power or threaten upheaval. Yet it struck deep in the minds of millions, from working-class citizens to lawmakers. And Julian Washington knew if this ended with just an apology, it would disappear like so many stories before. So he chose to do something different. On the 10th day after the incident, Julian stood before a strategy meeting with Asteria's top executives. No suit, no PowerPoint. Standing at the end of a long oak table, he was composed, but unwavering. We're not facing a PR challenge, he said. We're facing a moral reckoning. An older executive responded cautiously. We understand, Julian. However, a system-wide overhaul from training to operations is costly and difficult to sustain. We can commit to change, but acting on it. Julian interrupted, not harshly, but with resolve. It's not that we can. It's that we must. If a system allows someone to be dismissed based on skin color, age, or clothing, the failure isn't personal, it's structural. And if Asteria won't confront that truth, then Washington Global, our strategic partner, will withdraw all collaboration. Silence followed. No one dared challenge him. 3 days later, Asteria announced the most sweeping reform in its corporate history, the Dignity First Initiative. Not a media stunt, but a 5-point action plan. 1. Retraining 100% of global staff on anti-discrimination, cross-class cultural sensitivity, and ethics in service. 2. Establishing an anonymous reporting system so passengers and staff can report injustice without fear of retaliation. 3. Forming a diverse passenger advisory council, including representatives from vulnerable communities, older people, people of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people with disabilities. 4. Reviewing all customer privilege tiers to ensure nothing overrides the fundamental dignity of every passenger. 5. Publishing quarterly transparency reports on discrimination complaints and how they're addressed for public oversight. No airline had ever attempted such deep reform, let alone announced it publicly. But that boldness turned Asteria from the eye of the storm into a model of moral accountability. And standing beside the Asteria CEO during the announcement was none other than Julian Washington. He didn't speak much, but when asked why he pursued this so relentlessly, he said, "I didn't do this just for my mother. I did it for everyone in her shoes without a son to speak up beside them. We can lose money, contracts, market share, but when a company loses respect for its customers, it has already lost the one thing that matters most, its reason to exist." The Dignity First initiative caught global attention. Dozens of airlines requested to study and adopt its framework. Even non-aviation corporations began auditing their customer service policies. A story that started with one airplane seat had ignited a wave of cultural reform, powerful and deeply human. And Mrs. Sarah, she didn't care much for social media. She didn't follow the news. But she knew something had changed. Handwritten letters from strangers arrived at her doorstep. One read, "I'm 65 and I feel like someone spoke for me for the first time." Another, scribbled by a child, said, "You remind me of my grandma. I'm proud of you." She couldn't reply to them all, but she read everyone. And when someone asked her, "Do you think you made a big difference?" she smiled and replied, "I just kept the seat I paid for." Turns out, holding on to what's right can clear a path for others to stand tall. The evening sun bathed the old red-tiled roofs in Sarah's quiet neighborhood, where she'd lived for nearly 40 years. She sat silently on her armchair by the window, a steaming cup of ginger tea in hand. Outside, children rode bicycles, laughing, unaware that the older woman at the window was the spark of a nationwide awakening. Julian sat beside his mother. No laptop, no documents, no talk of business. For once he allowed himself to do only one thing, sit with her with no agenda. "You know, Mama," he said softly, "I received a letter from a cleaning staff member at Asteria. She said that since the campaign started, it's the first time someone called her by her real name instead of her badge number or a hurried glance. Mrs. Sarah smiled, her eyes distant. The feeling of being seen is something I went without for most of my life. But all it takes is one moment when we don't look away for others to find the courage to stand next time." They didn't say much more. Between them, every word had already been lived through action. A month later, at a national civil rights organization's gala, Mrs. Sarah was honored with the Guardian of Civil Dignity Award. She wasn't keen on accolades, but agreed to attend only because Julian persuaded her. "Not for yourself," he'd said, "but for those who need to see you." That night, she didn't give a long speech. She simply stood under the soft spotlight, facing a sea of people, and with a voice that trembled, yet carried weight, said, "I didn't think I was doing anything big. I just stayed in my seat. But if that helps someone else believe they deserve to be anywhere, their heart feels worthy, I know I didn't live in vain." The crowd rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the hall. In that crowd was a young woman holding her toddler. She leaned down and whispered, "Do you see her? That's an ordinary person who did something extraordinary because she refused to be silent." Sarah didn't change her lifestyle after the whirlwind. She still walked to the corner store each morning, made chicken soup on Friday nights, and replied to letters in brown ink with her slanted, careful handwriting. But something had shifted. Every time she boarded a flight, whether coach or first class, there was a particular look in the crew's eyes. Not pity, not celebrity recognition, but the gaze of someone who had learned something from her and was quietly grateful. Speaking at a global leadership forum, Julian once told his mother's story. But he didn't end with numbers or accolades. He said change doesn't always need a microphone or a camera. Sometimes it begins with one person refusing to get up, not out of stubbornness, but because it was right. My mother did that. And when your moment comes, I hope you won't leave your seat either. One late afternoon, Julian and his mother returned to Flight 497. They had been invited back not for their names, but for what they stood for. As they stepped into the cabin, a young flight attendant approached. She wasn't on that infamous flight, but her eyes held something profound, a gratitude passed from generation to generation. "Mrs. Washington," she said gently, "Seat 1A is ready for you." Sarah looked at the seat, then turned to Julian. She smiled. "I'll sit here again. Not because this seat is special, but because it reminds me that every seat is sacred when you earn it with dignity." And she sat down, not just to fly somewhere, but to remind the world. Sometimes when one person refuses to move, they help an entire society shift.